Yeah, I'm kind of thinking the same thing. Yeah, give me a second to kind of warm up here. It's kind of really super early here. But I'm trying to I was trying to put myself into, how if I was to code something, how would I do that? How am I going to wrap my mind around what could possibly be happening? And here's here's about the only thing I could come up with. I think I'm thinking that it's a multi-threading issue. And what I mean by that is that I think that in the base game where I've seen myself, and it's been so long since I played an unmodded game. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I believe I had the very same thing that you described, where I would be sitting in midair and the chair would be someplace else. So I think that is a base game threading issue. And the way that I'm thinking about this is, let's say that you have these objects that are defined by data, and you're loading that data to recreate a 3D environment. You can obviously see what you're rendering in an XYZ axis, and then you can wrap around that shape. But as you described, and I remember seeing that the mesh can have collision data that is different than the actual rendering data. And that is how the mesh can be bigger than what the actual object is. And this is where I think that, and I really hate to say this, but I think Todd really stretched the truth when he talks about things they can tweak. So if you have a lot of objects that you want fine collision detection, hitboxing if you want to call it that, then it's going to slow the system down because you've got more objects you want to test. But you can make the collision boxes bigger, but the actual visual object isn't. But that gives you a visual anomaly to where I'm short enough to run under this overhang, but yet I can't because the collision mesh is too large. And I think that's why I think the guy who did SUP came up, or somebody came up with uneducated shooter, which literally decreases the collision box size or the data table value. So that means the collision data is there. Okay. So the mesh does have links to the texture and the actual mesh of the object, the shape, so it can wrap the texture around that shape. But then it has collision data that must be passed or should be passed to another thread which builds the nav meshing, which I don't want to say builds it, but it builds it. It takes the base nav meshing, and now it has to start adding collision mesh clipping onto that nav meshing. So there has to be a thread to do that. So if in the original game, the vanilla game, if there is a chair, if an NPC is sitting in a chair and the chair is in another location, if the visual rendition of the chair, if the chair's mesh, not the collision mesh, but the chair's mesh is always in the right location, the XYZ location, if it's always correct, then it's always going to be in the same place, and that's what I'm seeing. I'm not seeing displaced objects. I'm not seeing, well, technically, when you click on them when you place them using workshop mode, they will stay in one location. They will literally stay there. If you click on it again, it might move 1 or 2 pixels, or it may just simply be highlighting, which gives the illusion of moving. However, when I've used transfer settlements, I've noticed that sometimes when I click on something, it'll jump 8 pixels out of the ground. So there is some kind of thing happening to where, and I'm thinking maybe it's a floating point error, or somehow it's an error somewhere when he's placing the object. Because I'm assuming that's a single, I forget what it is when I looked at the data, if it's a single variable with a single floating point. I don't think it's double, but it might be double. I doubt very seriously it's integer, but it could be. I've seen that happen. But the visual object is always there, but it's the collision that is disassociated. So I'm thinking I've seen that in the vanilla game. So now imagine if you have F4SE plugins that are accessing data that's not ready. Because how would you know? Let's say the game engine has a process. So as an example, when I load into Sanctuary, when I first load into Sanctuary, it's got to, like say it's a cold load. It's cold, so it's going to have to load all of the data since none of it exists at the moment. However, if I immediately go back in, and that takes a while, but if I go back in and I just reload the exact same game save, I'm in the game and I stay in the game, but I reload the same game save, it loads much faster because the game engine says, I don't need to reload these objects. I don't need to reload them because I already have them in memory. And that speeds up the loading process. That I would consider normal. So I don't know or think that it might be that might be the issue, because when I go to when I actually
Download managed.
when I actually load the reload the game, the meshes that didn't have collision have them, but not all. It's not complete. It's completely random. So the bug is there, and perhaps the bug is there in the vanilla game, which, the person is disassociated from the chair, the collision mesh. He's sitting on a collision mesh that isn't there because the game doesn't care, because where's it going to put the chair marker? Because you have to have an idle marker for that furniture. So you have all these data records and data components that you're trying to compile into a virtual space so that 3D NPCs can interact in that virtual space. So you'll have idle markers. And it would be too difficult, you could you could have a lot of conditional checks which says, okay, is it a furniture object? Yes, it is. Is it a bed? Yes, it is. Which side are you, you could do things like that to determine, or if it's a chair, furniture marker, yes, chair, yes, then you need to do a sitting animation. And I think that there are sitting points that you have to, I would imagine, now I haven't looked at a mesh this detail, but I would imagine for me to do it programmatically, I would need to say, okay, this is a point where I need to set. This is my target XYZ point. And then this is the animation I'm going to play, and the delta translations are going to be from where I'm at now, the XYZ point of my rear end where I'm going to sit down, the pixel that, let's say my spinal, my tailbone is going to be positioned at an XYZ on a sitting object, and then I can transition the skeleton there, which everything should follow suit. And I'm kind of spitballing this, just kind of like this stream thinking as I go. That, as a programmer, that's how I would see myself needing to do it. And then once I know how the skeleton, if the skeleton's connected, all I got to do is move the skeletal bones, and then we're sitting down. And I think that's what the animation software does. So I would just need and so to make it easier, I can use animation markers. So I can set a marker, and then once an NPC gets near that marker, I don't have to do a lot of checks. I can put the animation markers in their own table. I don't have to check every object in a workshop, in a settlement to see, or anywhere in any cell to see if it's a furniture and all this. I just say, is there an animation marker? So I think that's optimization. As a programmer, I would see doing that as a way to optimize, to speed up being able to idle inside of I'm going to call it a scene not being a rendered FMV or something that is program controlled, an in-game program controlled animation, but this is just how the scene plays out, how the actual visual plays out. I can perfectly see, because that's a much shorter list to check, because I can wander around, do collision checking, and then I can literally say, am I near an idle marker, or do I need to idle? Yes, let me find the nearest idle marker, and it's more quick and efficient to place light. So that way you have an idle marker, and then you attach an animation to that marker, which is something they kind of did with companions. If you look back at Skyrim, they did that with companions with Serana, because they're like, Serana, if you remember, it says Serana can idle at any idle marker, whereas other NPCs have specific idle markers. She has a open idle package. So if you go into, let's say, the Temple of Dibella, she starts praying. If you go into near a like a workbench, or I forget what you call them, but I think it's a workbench, she starts hammering on the thing. She acts like she's like doing what the player does, because she it looks for any idle marker, and that's what Serana does. She has an open package, and they included that. They took that one system. Somebody said, oh, we're going to take this existing system, we're going to open it up. If we do this, this opens it up, and it's going to look like new technology, but it's not technically new technology. It's reusing existing technology in a new way. So it's a new process using existing technology. So it's kind of a misnomer when you look at it, and I think that's what I think in one way, and I know I'm kind of getting all over the map here, but I think that's one of the things that aggravates, I think, a lot of us Bethesda fans about what they're doing, because in a sense, you could call it tweaking. When you say, oh, we can tweak all these variables, yes, there are variables you can tweak. Most of them are global variables, and it really affects the whole thing, but it doesn't make the experience better. It just changes the experience. Okay, so that being said, yeah, so I'm thinking that there's multi-threading going on, and it's building the nav mesh. It's building the nav. It's the nav clipping and the nav mesh, I think, is what it's, nav cutting. I think it's building that in memory. So it's doing that separate from the object. And somehow there is a translation problem. I think it existed in the original game, because I think it's a multi-threading issue. Because once you load the mesh, the thread that loads the data actually has the mesh. It has the data for the mesh, and it can start rendering that object. But well, let me rephrase it. It loads the object. I've got the object. I need the change form that says this is the XYZ position of where this is placed. I need a change form. So now it moves it. It'll not moves it, but it actually renders it in that XYZ position. Then you're going to have some kind of thread that builds the nav meshing for the area. Otherwise, as you see, you can run completely through the object. So that, by looking at the behavior of that, it tells me there is a thread that renders what you see, and there is a thread that renders the actual what you don't see, or the nav meshing. And when those two are jiving together, when those two are in sync, in other words, when the XYZs are in sync, it gives the illusion of a solid object. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a disassociation between what you see and the actual nav meshing for the object, but it's not on all objects. It seems to be kind of random. What I need to do is actually when I go back into Sanctuary, verify that it's the same objects every time, because if it is, that is something with the data. It might be something with the scripts. Now, I'm using transfer settlements. So what I'm thinking about doing is I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my settlement. Let me think. I have not discovered all settlements yet. So I don't know if I have anybody assigned at Hangman's Alley, because there is floors there. There is foundations, and I can walk through them. I can fall through them. So what I want to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm going to destroy everything. I'm going to remove all the objects. I'm going to destroy the settlement. And then what I want to do is I'm going to export it with Workshop Framework. And then I'm going to import it with Workshop Framework and see if I have the same issue. Because this issue that I'm showing might be specific to transfer settlements. Or it might be, as you're mentioning, that it must be done with an F4SE plugin, that somehow the plugins are accessing data before the data is ready. In other words, you have a game engine that has a certain flow. It's a workflow. It's the flow of the data through the code, through the conditionals, to provide the end user with a given result, a presentation of a result. So if you access that data before the game engine has completed the workflow processes for that object, then there is going to be anomalies. There's going to be errors, especially if, and an example of that would be when you're loading, there was I don't know if it still exists, but, where a person would place a table and they would place objects on the table. And then the havoc, if you think about it for a second, the havoc or the collision for the object on the table loads before the table's havoc does. And then the object winds up falling through the table. So I'm wondering if this is simply that which existed in the vanilla game magnified. Because now you have F4SE plugins that are accessing data tables. So as an example, if I was, let's say you have somebody who goes, oh, I want to put objects, and I'm not necessarily, this is like transfer settlements, but let's say I have somebody that says, oh, I want to put objects in the game. Where's the object table? Oh, well, I can access it through here. I found the object table, and I found it through F4SE. It says, oh, I can access it this way. Or an NPC table, for that matter. I can access it this way. And then they load that table, and they start doing what they're doing without any understanding of the actual workflow of loading a cell, how the game loads a cell. And if that happens, then you're going to have disassociation problems between what you see and what you can actually react to. That would make sense because it's not fully built before, let's say when an object fires off, if he attaches a script, like let's say transfer settlements, if a script is attached to an object, when that object is loaded, that script can fire off, but loaded might not mean that the nav meshing is built. It might mean something else. So the only thing I can think of is somehow there's some kind of weird thing going on where a plugin is trying to connect or reassociate the collision mesh with the actual mesh that you see, the visual mesh. That's the only thing I can think of. All right, I'm gonna get started here today, and let me. I've got a few things I got to do this morning, and then I'm going to run the game. I'm gonna go over to Hangman's Alley, and I'm gonna take a look at that. I'm gonna delete everything in there, and then I'm gonna try to. Well, let me export it first, and let me export it, and then let me try to re-import it using Workshop Framework, and then see if I have the same issue. Because if I don't, then that's a problem that he's doing somewhere in transfer settlements, where he's doing some type of thing where he's trying to make sure everything's okay, but in the process it's janking out. All right, so let me get started with all this, and then I'll hop back on a little bit later and show you what I came up with. I might have to get an example of how to export with Workshop Framework. I do have Papyrus logging set, so I know what I can do is I can actually run it, take a look at the Papyrus log, and then I think I need to upload the Papyrus log to a website which will provide me with a plugin. Is that correct? Because it has to read the Papyrus log, get the object, get the form ID, and then create like a series of object records that are placed at those XYZ locations. Is that correct? All right. Well, let me let you go, and then I'm gonna head off and get my day started, and then I'll post back with some results as soon as I can.